Tom Gregory, age 56.
Spencer Moeller, age 50.
Robert Heron, age 43.
Glenn Weaver, 53.
Joel Robinson, 62.
Jamie Nolan, age 57.
All right. There I sat, my jaw open, trying to process that my successful college-educated friend, mother of two, had just shared with me that she'd voluntarily quit her job to become an escort. Today, we're going to talk about the costs and ineffectiveness of the war on prostitution. By the end, I hope to have persuaded you that prostitution should be decriminalized, should be regulated, and should be taxed. Some of you are going to be against this and be fairly hostile to it. I hope that you remember that legality and morality are two separate things, and that I'm not going to be talking about morality today, but rather the effectiveness of it, and maybe open your mind as to a few of the statistics that have been gathered on it. Others of you are more open to the idea, and I'm going to share some statistics and information that you may not have as well to help you persuade others to get the laws changed. Personally, I've actually known a couple different escorts / prostitutes that I didn't know that was their profession when I met them, but as I got to know them, they shared that either was their profession or at some point in their life they had engaged in that as a profession. I've also done a lot of research for this. There's actually a fair amount of research and articles, especially in recent years, being published about it. Read about 150 pages of information, about 12 to 15 different publications on both sides of the issue, and there's definitely some strong opinions on it. We're going to talk about how fighting prostitution, like the war on drugs, is costly, that it's ineffective, that it actually harms sex workers rather than protects them, and that legalizing it both protects them and generates revenue for our country. So the first thing that we're going to talk about today is that enforcement of prostitution laws is extremely costly. There have only been a couple studies done on the overall costs nationwide about prostitution costs. The last one that was actually authoritative was in 1987, and it was done on about 40 different cities across the country. The numbers that I'm going to reference I've inflation adjusted for 2015 to make them more relevant to today. The article is America's Cities and the Costs of Prostitution Control. It's published in the Hastings Law Journal, volume 38, issue 4 in 1987. So, the first things obviously that makes enforcing prostitution laws expensive is the fact that we have to get the arrests. The arrests are expensive because prostitutes know who police officers are. So they have to rotate police officers in and out of the enforcement ring. By the time that a prostitute is arrested for the first time, they've expended about $11,000 of inflation-adjusted revenue to make that single arrest. One of the most incredible things is that on average, a prostitute has to be arrested 3 times before they serve any jail time. So before they ever even really go through the legal process, we've expended about $30,000 in trying to fight prostitution with a single person. Also, according to the article, only 11% of convicted prostitutes serve jail time, but in 1987 in California, 30% of all jailed women were jailed because of prostitution. So we've got massive costs because of jailing them for the crime of prostitution. In 16 cities alone in the study, spent an inflation-adjusted $261 million a year in jailing prostitutes. So they're spending so much money that they could be spending on other programs. The average spend per city in the study was $15 million in prostitution enforcement per year. So enforcement of prostitution laws is also extremely time consuming. On average, it takes 42 hours of police time to arrest a single prostitute. That's after the investigation has started. Most of that time occurs inside the police station processing paperwork or bringing the person through the system. It also consumes 4 hours of court time per prostitute. So there's additional costs generated through the prosecution of prostitutes. The same study, the American Cities and Cost of Prostitution Control, also found that in New York City during the time of the study, 92% of the cases of reported prostitution resulted in arrests. Unfortunately, only 5% of violent crimes resulted in arrests that were reported to the police department. So there's a massive amount of resources being spent, about 11% of police resources, on enforcing prostitution, while they're unable to get to other crimes that impact people. This visual aid here shows two different graphs. One of them is prostitution arrests by year, which is trending slightly downward, but is expected to stabilize. And the other one is prostitution arrests by state. So there is a heavy concentration of prostitution in a certain number of states. Those numbers aren't really changing very much. The next visual aid that we're going to look at is actually who utilizes prostitutes. There's very little agreement on prostitute utilization rate. You can see several different studies in the United States alone over a relatively short period of time vary between 16 and 45%. The mean is 52% of men use prostitutes at some point in their life, with a range of 27 to 77%, which means that statistically about half of us in the room have at some point or at some point in our life will utilize prostitution. So we looked at how ineffective it is to criminalize it and expensive it is to prosecute it. Let's take a look at how it actually hurts sex workers. So one of the first things that happens, of course, is sex workers can be abused by their employers, usually the people who have hired them. A study, the Review of Violence Against Sex Workers, May 2014, in the National Institute of Health, found that 45 to 75% of sex workers are abused on the job in any given year. But they also found that abuse is drastically increased through the illegalization of prostitution. It also, prostitution being illegal, has been found to increase the use of pimps, which generates more violence as well. Also, the War on Sex Workers in Reason Magazine in February 2013 found it's not sex that exposes sex workers to violence. It's our willingness to abandon sex workers to violence in an attempt to control their behavior. The last thing that increases violence is the fact that law enforcement actively prosecutes prostitution and the resources they use for safety. In the last couple of years, websites such as My Red Book, Craigslist, Backpage have all been shut down or drastically decreased. These are resources that prostitutes use to pre-screen their applicants, and closing these websites is causing them to be forced onto the streets, which generates more problems for them. We've seen that enforcement is costly and ineffective. Let's talk about legislation for a minute. Legalizing prostitution is better not only for society, but it's also better for the sex workers themselves. A study in the Australian Journal of Public Health found that decriminalization of prostitution is associated with better coverage of health promotion programs for sex workers, which means they have better access to health care, preventative care, sexually transmitted disease screening, those types of things. There are very few arguments that are made against legalizing prostitution for society. One of those is a bandwagon logical fallacy, which says legalized prostitution encourages prostitution. We've heard this a couple times before in our life. Legalized alcohol encourages drinking alcohol, for example. A study in the Cato Institute for Alcohol Prohibition found that alcohol prohibition not only was a failure, but in July 17, 1991, they reported that alcohol usage actually increased during Prohibition, and it spawned organized crime. And for prostitution, that spawns things like sex trafficking, minor trafficking, abuse of pimps, those types of things. Another argument along the same type of thing is legalizing marijuana increases marijuana use. There was a study done at National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine in 1999 that found that over 13 states since 1973, there's little evidence that decriminalization of marijuana use leads to a substantial increase in the use of marijuana. So in other controversial topics, we found that legalizing something doesn't necessarily make it moral, and it also doesn't necessarily increase the utilization of that thing. The last thing is that people say that it increases the use of STDs. This is slippery slope, and a post-legalization study in Germany found that there's no difference in STD infection rates between sex workers and the general population after prostitution was legalized in Germany. It was also, ironically, legal in Rhode Island for 7 years accidentally, and during that period of time, not only did rapes decrease, but gonorrhea also decreased, according to Decriminalizing Indoor Prostitution, Implications for Sexual Violence and Public Health in the National Bureau of Economic Research. Today, we've talked about the costs and ineffectiveness of the war on prostitution. We've shared how sex workers are harmed by prostitution being criminalized, and how legalizing it benefits both sex workers and society. I could have chose to berate my friend, but instead I chose to listen. She shared that although she did fear being arrested, she was able to earn more in a single 1-hour date than in an entire week at her previous job. She was able to spend more time with her 2 young children, and that she didn't see a difference between hooking up with a random person from a bar and being paid for sex. I realize that we like to paint the world black and white, but it's really many different shades of gray. As a result of this speech, I'm hoping that each of you will review my research that I'm making available on the shelf over here, and that you'll contact your state legislators and ask them to decriminalize prostitution, regulate it, and tax it. Martin Luther King reflected on many different things well, and I think it applies here as well, when he said morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. Go ahead and sweep.